So today's video, why there's no such thing as mental illness. What? Sorry, that was what you heard there was the mating call of the indigenous cockatoo. Why I'm negative about positive psychology. Back to the story, because I've got a story to tell you. So I've got some top tips on writing the report. If you are studying an undergraduate degree in psychology, I urge you to think critically. It helps people like me stop doing stupid things. Okay, so no such thing as mental illness. Well, that sounds a very controversial and possibly distasteful thing to say, doesn't it? So you are denying the fact that people are struggling. Well, actually, there's nothing controversial in saying that there's no such thing as mental illness. Well, here's the thing. The claim that such things as depression, schizophrenia, anxiety disorder and so on are mental illnesses, that's actually the controversial thing. Okay, so I've got my cup of coffee, all's well with the world as far as I'm concerned right now, except for the fact I didn't put on insect repellent, which means that I'm probably going to get bitten again because it's been raining and I haven't learnt my lesson. Oh well, we'll get through this somehow. I shall be brave. Also, this little white thing there, don't worry, it's not part of the fauna of Australia. It is not an insect that is attacking me because I'm not wearing insect repellent. It's just my lavalier mic, so I could improve the sound quality a bit, which might be a little bit undone by the fact there's a lawnmower going around in the botanical gardens just now. So apologies for that if there's no improvement whatsoever on the sound. Anyway, let's get back to the point, because I was talking about how saying that there's no such thing as mental illness is not actually a controversial thing to say. But I need to explain myself, Well, here's the thing. The claim that things like depression, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders and so on are illnesses is the thing that's actually controversial and actually perhaps distasteful. The controversial claim is that when someone experiences psychological problems, that those problems are caused by something going wrong with them physiologically, like it's like a physical illness. The most common claim is that psychological problems are caused by something going wrong in our brains, that the cause is in some form of brain malfunction or disruption. There's something wrong in our brain, there's something at that biological, physiological level that's causing the problems. And that's why we call it a mental illness, because there's a claim that it is a physical, biological thing. Now that's the controversial claim, because there is no evidence to support the claim that there's a biological problem, that it's a problem with your brain. That claim is speculative. It's a guess, and some of us would say it's not a very good guess. In spite of what we're told, no one has yet found a biological or physiological sign for any symptom of a psychological disorder. Now, first you need to know what those words mean, because they mean a particular thing in a medical sense. Signs and symptoms, they mean particular things, so I'll just explain that. A symptom is any subjective evidence of illness. It's a feeling we have, and it's our description of that feeling. So a good example would be pain. We can tell someone that we're in pain, but that's based on our subjective feeling of the pain. And the symptom is not something that can be observed directly by a clinician. So the clinician doesn't feel your pain. I know we sometimes say, I feel your pain, but you don't actually feel the pain of someone else, you know? It's only the person who feels the pain. They have the subjective feeling, and then they can report on it. And that's how the clinician finds out that you're in pain. Also, a clinician can infer that you might be in pain. You know, if your face is all scrunched up, or you wince, or let out a little yelp, they might ask, oh, you look like you're in pain. Are you in pain? And that's the clinician asking you. They're making an inference, but they can't directly observe it. They can make an inference. They can question whether you're in pain, and they can get a sense that you might be in pain, but they don't feel your pain. A sign is something different. That is something that a clinician can directly observe and can objectively measure. So an example would be, say, how many white blood cells you have, and it can be directly observed through a blood cell count, and it's not something that the clinician has to rely on your subjective account for. You know, that it's something the clinician can directly observe. So that's a sign. And diseases are usually made up of signs and symptoms, and you need both in order for something to be classified as an illness. Now, what you'll notice, if you or your loved one has ever been diagnosed with any form of mental illness, depression, schizophrenia, an anxiety disorder, you'll have noticed that that diagnosis was not made on the basis of a physiological test. You didn't give a blood sample, and from that blood sample you weren't diagnosed with depression or schizophrenia or whatever. You didn't have a brain scan, and from the brain scan get diagnosed. There aren't any physiological tests. So when you're being diagnosed, you might actually be asked to give a blood sample, but that will not be to test for depression, but to test to see if there are any other issues going on for you. If there is a physical illness behind your symptoms, if there are signs that can be observed that might indicate something else is going on. So an example would be if you're feeling fatigued, you're tired all the time, you might have asked to give a blood sample so the physician can check to see that you're not suffering from diabetes, for example. i.e., it's not a test of mental illness, but it's a test to see if something else is going on. So we don't have any physiological diagnostic tests for mental illness. They don't exist. That's the first indication that something controversial is being claimed when people say that mental illness exists, when they say it's an illness, like it's a physical illness. Now, when you put this argument forward, it is seen as controversial, and people will commonly respond in a number of ways. First, they'll say, oh no, you're wrong, because they have found the biological physiological marker. You know, they have found, for example, a gene behind depression. They found a gene for depression, or they found a gene for schizophrenia, or they found the thing in the brain that stops working which causes people to become depressed. Now, you see that from time to time, and it gets reported in the press, but what you don't see are the follow-up studies that actually discredit those findings, show that those were false findings, that there was something wrong in the research, in the methods that were used, or the analysis, or that it was an incorrect finding. That doesn't get reported on. Perhaps it's not viewed as sexy news or worthy news. You know, it doesn't make it through the editorial decisions of our newspapers, so you don't see those findings. But I promise you, if you go through the academic literature, you will find study upon study that shows that any of those initial studies that showed there was, for example, a gene that accounts for depression, that research was false. The next response you often get, and you often get this from psychologists, is that, and psychiatrists as well, that they'll say, okay, we haven't found the biological physical marker for mental illness yet, but it will be found. Just give us time and we'll get there, and that we're getting closer. Now that sounds reasonable, but actually it's not. It's not reasonable, or it would be reasonable if the people looking for the biological physical markers didn't have the expertise that they needed to do that job, or if they didn't have the funding they needed to do that job, or if they hadn't had time to do that job. And none of those things stand. So we find some of our best people working in medicine, in medical psychiatry, looking for the biological physical marker, and they can't find it. So it's not the case that the people looking for it don't know what they're doing. They do know what they're doing. They're medically trained often. The medical researchers are looking for it, but they can't find it. The argument that there is insufficient resource, well, that's partly true in relation to the resources that go into understanding physical illnesses. Certainly the medical mental health research is less well funded, but by any margin the funding is not at such a low level that you'd expect poor quality work to be coming out. And the question about whether people have had enough time, well, this work began really seriously in the sense of what we understand of medical science today. It really began in the mid-1800s, late 1800s. So it's been going on for well over 150 years, certainly over 100 years, and they've had plenty of time. So it's not a case that it's just a new thing that people are looking into and they haven't had time to find this thing, and surely we imagine that we'll find it fairly soon. We've been at this a long time, so any reasonable person would conclude that actually there's something problematic in what they're looking for. Now the next question you'd probably ask is, why do most people think that there is such a thing as mental illness? Why is depression, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders commonly talked about as a mental illness, as a medical problem? Well, a number of reasons for this. One is that there are some very powerful pharmaceutical companies whose interest is served by us thinking that mental illness is an illness, a physiological illness that can be cured or treated through medicine, through psychopharmaceutical products. The other group, powerful group, who are advantaged by us believing that mental illness is an illness is government. And I'll explain that in just a second, but for the government it's much more convenient to think that there's something physiologically, biologically wrong with people when they're suffering from depression, anxiety and so on. It's quite advantageous for governments because it directs attention away from other potential causes for people's suffering. The other issue is that for people who are diagnosed with mental illness, it can actually be a really important label that can give significance and meaning to their suffering and their difficulties. It can mean that they're taken seriously. Because medical labels are often very serious and taken very seriously and taken as scientific, not just biased or subjective. You know, you've got a medical condition, it's taken as real. This can mean that when you're given that label, then your problems are taken as real. And this is a difficulty because you wouldn't want to not recognize and appreciate the difficulty people are in, because it's real suffering that people are going through. They're having real problems in life. And you wouldn't want to take away that recognition. And it would appear that by denying that they're ill in a sort of physical sense, that you're somehow denying their suffering. But the problem is that when you acquire a medical diagnosis for something that actually might not be biological or physiological, that it opens you up to a whole host of medical treatments that actually might be inappropriate or worse, put you at risk of further harm. When you take away that explanation for there being a biological, physiological marker for mental illness, what are you left with? Well, I'll tell you what you're left with. You're left with a fairly robust set of evidence to tell you what actually is causing the distress, and that's the social environment people are in. So it's issues like poverty, not having enough money, being in poor quality housing, being in a neighborhood or a community that is unsafe, being discriminated against, being devalued and treated badly by others. All these sorts of things are the things that we know contribute to psychological problems, people experiencing psychological problems. It's kind of, you know, you don't need a PhD really to figure this one out. It's kind of something that we understand intuitively. When someone treats you disrespectfully, it can make you feel bad about yourself. And if they do it over a prolonged period of time, and lots of people do it, then you can, feel really bad about yourself in lots of ways. And if society treats you badly, you know, you get the sense that you're not valued by society, then it can lead to psychological problems, depression, and you're living in an unsafe community, you know, stress, anxiety. Now, not everyone experiencing psychological problems will be able to put their finger on an issue like that. It's quite complicated because the social environments we live in are often very complicated, but it's something very much at the heart of the relationships we have with the people around us that contribute to our psychological health. Now, once you understand that that's what's behind it, then you can kind of understand why government, for example, might find it more beneficial to focus on an explanation of mental illness as being a biological problem, like a physical illness, rather than as a social problem, because it takes responsibility away from them to fix the social environment. And if that explanation was made, i.e. mental illness is caused by social problems, then suddenly the products that are coming out from the pharmaceutical industry in relation to the products that are there to treat mental illness suddenly lose their relevance or value. And suddenly the risk-benefit equation, where you weigh up whether the risks of taking a particular drug are outweighed by the benefits, that calibration shifts. The cost-benefit ratio gets recalibrated, because if a drug has some potential problems with it, if it's a very powerful drug, and all of our psychotherapeutic drugs, psychotropic drugs, the drugs that are there to change our mental states, all of them are extremely powerful drugs, it becomes very risky to use those drugs, so it's a threat to the drug industry. As for the people experiencing the problems, one of the problems of treating mental illness as an illness is that when you try to address that problem of stigma, the stigma surrounding mental illness, you have a really hard job of doing that when you conceptualize this thing like a physical illness, because not many of us really want to hang around people who are physically ill. You know, if you're at work and someone comes in work and they complain about symptoms that sound like flu, you don't really want to spend much time with them, because there's every chance that you're going to be infected. And that's kind of a natural response. You know, we care about the other people's welfare, but actually we don't want to get too close to them and spend much time with them, because there's a fear of contagion. And that's kind of quite a normal response, really. So it's hard to tackle issues of stigma when you're talking about something in terms of an illness. So maybe that will actually help us to empathize with people who are experiencing things like depression, schizophrenia, and so on, who are experiencing psychological difficulty. We're able to better relate. We know what it's like to be in a social environment that is not good for us. Like, we know what it's like perhaps to be in a relationship that's not good for us, or to be in employment that it is not good for us, or living in a place that we don't feel safe or comfortable living in. Worries about what's going to happen in our future, what's happening to our loved ones, worrying about all sorts of social problems that affect a lot of people. Maybe you can relate to that, so maybe it actually increases the understanding and reduces the stigma. Okay, enough from me. Hope you found that useful or interesting. Let me know your views. Write down your comments below. Give me the thumbs up if you found it interesting. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And that's all from me for now. So until next time, ta-ra.